In 2005, I was invited to a luncheon in Chicago to talk about Guantanamo. It was one of these bar associations that just has luncheons on different topics, and I just thought it sounded like an interesting subject, and I signed up to go. And I got sick, I got bronchitis, and I didn't go to the luncheon. But since I had signed in, I got a little thank you note saying thank you for being there. Obviously, they didn't take attendance. And a reminder that there were still over, it was either 200 or 300 men still without attorneys at Guantanamo. And when I read the email, I was shocked. Illinois alone has something like 70,000 attorneys. The country has more attorneys than we know what to do with. And the fact that there could be 200 to 300 men at Guantanamo without an attorney, to me, was shocking. I called the number of the person. It was actually someone from a big law firm in Chicago who was coordinating, trying to get volunteer attorneys in the Chicago area. And I called him and I said, you know, what's going on? Why are there all these men without attorneys? And he said, well, you know, people are kind of nervous about getting involved in this. The big firms don't want to. They don't want to be considered supporting terror, you know, supporting these guys who are gnawing through the hydraulic lines. And so I said, well, I'd like to get more information. Maybe I could do something. I was a solo practitioner, as I've been all through my 30-year career, but I've always been known to take on something if I thought it was right. So I went, the first step with CCR, Center for Constitutional Rights, was the umbrella organization, and it continues to be the umbrella organization, and to train and to help and support the volunteer attorneys. And so they had a conference call. They were doing them every month at that time, trying to get attorneys interested in the litigation and trying to get attorneys to volunteer. And so I volunteered to go to be on the first conference call, and it was a 2-hour call. People from CCR and a couple of attorneys who were already involved in the litigation kind of discussed what to expect and what was going on. And one of the things that first caught my ear, well, everything was new to me at that point. This was, again, the fall of 2005. They said, you don't have any attorney-client privilege. Well, as an attorney, that's the cornerstone of our practice, that we can talk with our clients and we can take notes and we can have a confidential communication with the clients. And so when I said, what do you mean there's no attorney-client privilege? And they said, well, your notes all have to be turned over to the military and the Justice Department. So when you meet with your clients, you'll take notes and then you'll turn them over to the military and they'll read them and they'll redact things that they don't think should be in the public eye, and they'll send you your notes back, and if you want to read the redacted things, you have to go to this secret location in Washington, D.C. area. I could be struck dead for saying where it is. It's confidential. So I was like, well, I won't take notes. I'll show them. And they said, well, that's fine, but then you can't use anything that your client tells you publicly or in court papers unless you file it under seal. And frankly, one of the things that we need to do is to get out the stories of our clients. So they suggested not keeping the notes in my head, which probably wouldn't have been a safe place for them anyway. So when I heard some of the stories and heard about the litigation through this phone call, I decided to take it the next step, which was a 2-day seminar in Washington, D.C. And the seminar was both a kind of a legal hands-on, where we were walk through some of the papers that we would be filing. As a civil rights attorney, I'm very familiar with the federal courts, but I'd never done a habeas petition before. As it turns out, it doesn't matter because no one has done habeas cases like these ever, and hopefully never will again. But they walked us through some of the pleadings. They had a detainee who had just been freed, teleconferenced in. He was one of the Tipton Three. He was in Great Britain. He talked to us from Great Britain for about 45 minutes to an hour. I think at that point he had only been free for about a month, and the story he told was both moving and shocking and sad. And so by the end of the 2 days, I was ready to take on my first client. I'm telling you this because these are kind of the questions that people always ask me: how did I get involved? And then the other question is, how do you get to the base of So I'm going to answer some of these basic questions. To tell you everything that has gone on these 7 years, 8 years, is beyond this time period in this session. But I'll tell you, my one client, I ended up with 2 clients. One is free, and the other is on the indefinite detention list. The way I got my clients, after I attended the 2-day seminar, was I got a call from CCR. Actually, I think it was an email, and they assigned the clients. And the way they were assigning clients, at this point, the government was still refusing to even give the names of the men at Guantanamo to protect their privacy. And there was a FOIA request out from New York Times and Washington Post and some other newspapers that was pending in court at the end of 2005. And the judge had ordered, I believe by the end of 2005, had ordered the military to release the names, but they did not, and they were fighting it still with motions to continue. So the way the names were coming to CCR of the men that were there were through the first men who actually had clients who were, somehow their families found out about them, maybe through the International Red Cross. They were clients primarily from Saudi Arabia, one other country I'm forgetting. And anyway, they actually hired attorneys to represent these, their children, their men. And so those men would collect names of other men who wanted attorneys, and they would give them to their attorneys in the meetings. The attorneys, of course, had to turn these over to the military and to the DOJ. And eventually the names started coming out in the notes. It was taking a long time, and sometimes spelling was wrong, and sometimes other information was wrong. So for my client, I forgot what nationality I was told he was, but he wasn't that nationality. It turns out he was Libyan. That was Mr. Al-Jazawi. And Mr. Al-Jazawi really wanted an attorney bad. He was ill, and he had signed every list that was going around the camp. I guess the guys were sending out lists saying, if you want an attorney, sign here. He was on like 7 or 8 different lists. He was also sending notes to people who were meeting with their clients or with their attorneys saying, tell your attorney, I want one too. And it turns out that he spoke a little bit of English. I didn't know this at the time. As I said, first I was told he was a different nationality, and then I learned somehow that he was Libyan. And I sent him a letter, but at that point I hadn't had my clearance yet. You have to go through a process of being cleared for security purposes. For most of us, it was a secret level clearance, which took a couple of months. And so I sent him a letter just through the regular mail. And lo and behold, through the regular mail, at the same time, I got a letter from him. And he said he heard I was his attorney. One of the attorneys told him. And he was happy I was his attorney, and could I please come and see him because he was very ill. And it took me about 5 months to get clearance to actually go to Guantanamo to see him the first time. I've been to Guantanamo about 30 times now, primarily because of Mr. Al-Jazawi, who was so ill. I was going every 6, 8, 10 weeks trying to monitor his health, trying to get a judge to do something about the lack of health care that he was getting. And I was afraid he was going to die, and at least I wanted to make a record of everything that I had done and let him tell me everything he wanted to tell me. So that was my first client, and then during this process of getting my security clearance, CCR had filed a massive habeas petition on behalf of everyone who was at the base that they knew of. And this was because of the Detainee Treatment Act that was filed in 2005, which was passed in 2005 and signed by Bush, right, I think on New Year's Eve. Because that act was taking away the writ of habeas corpus in the future for men at Guantanamo. And so they wanted to make sure everybody that they knew of was covered under a petition. But of course they didn't have enough attorneys to handle those. So those of us who were already representing men, they asked us if we would take on 1 or 2 others. And I said, okay, I'll take on 1 more, but I want a Libyan since I have a Libyan, so I'm only dealing with 1 country. And of course, my Libyan client turned out to be Algerian. So I had they're neighbors though, Libya and Algeria. So, but anyway, so Mr.
Close enough for government work.
Right.
Sorry.
That's right. And so in June of 2006 was the first time that I went to the base. And what people always want to know is first, how the heck do you get there? And it's amazing. Well, we fly to Fort Lauderdale. You could also fly, I think it was to Jamaica. The same little island hopper airline flew from Fort Lauderdale to Guantanamo to Jamaica. And I never did that trip, though. I always did the Fort Lauderdale one. So you get to Fort Lauderdale, and you go to the ground level of the airport, where they have these little hopper planes. You never went through security. To me, it was the most amazing thing. I'm going to this military base that, you know, holds the worst of the worst, and no one ever puts you through security. You do have to have a piece of paper showing the military has cleared you for this flight, but it's you know, it's a cargo flight. They're carrying a lot of cargo to the base, and it has like 10 or 12 seats on it. It's very uncomfortable, and it's a very long ride. Everybody says, "Oh, it's Guantanamo, so close to Florida. You must be there and like that." Well, no, because we have to go all the way around the airspace of Cuba. So the flight was actually between 3 and 4 hours each time we went. And depending on the cargo in the plane, sometimes they had to stop on an island to refuel. The plane was a little heavy. And sometimes they announced that mid-flight. It was like, really, didn't you know this before? Of course, there's no bathroom on the plane, so they tease you by giving you pop and water and stuff for your 3 to 4 hour flight. And then you land, and when I'm telling you about this trip to Guantanamo, this was my first trip, and it's still like etched up here. But over the years, the procedures changed. They changed one way and then a different way. And almost, I can't say almost every time I went, but like every 3 or 4 months, the procedures would change. And the airlines that flew there changed. They kept going under. I guess it wasn't as lucrative as they hoped. So that we're now on the 3rd airline that flies there. Last month, the new commander at Guantanamo, the one that has caused a new hunger strike to be going on at the base, which is almost all of the men right now engaged in a now 3-month hunger strike, canceled the airline. He has blamed attorneys for this hunger strike, and I guess his way of making sure that the hunger strike ends is to keep us out of there. So he canceled the airlines. Unfortunately, that means the International Red Cross couldn't work there. It means that a lot of families for military people who do sometimes get passes to come and see their sons or daughters at Guantanamo, or husbands or wives, they couldn't get there. And it lasted about 3 weeks, and then they decided that they better reinstate the plane. So it's no longer grounded. It was a short-term threat. So, but anyway, going there the first time, I remember as we pulled into the island, into the base, it's very arid looking. I expected it to be lush and green. Of course, this was summer. It was their dry season. When you got off the plane, you were brought into an area with big tables like these, and you put out your suitcase, and they kind of looked in your suitcase to see if there was anything you weren't supposed to bring. I had binoculars with me. I asked ahead of time because I like to do bird watching. And I was waiting to see, you know, someone going to raise their eyebrows. That didn't happen till later, and if we have time, I'll tell you about that later. Then they close it up, and there was supposed to be someone there, I understand, an escort to meet me, but he never showed up, and I didn't know he was even supposed to show up. I knew from other attorneys what I was supposed to do. I kind of got a rundown, and that was that once I went through security, there's a bus out there, and get on the bus and take it to the CBQ. And if you tell the bus driver you're going to the CBQ, there's only like 3 stops. He'll drop you off, and he'll tell you when you're there. The first time I went there, it was a weekend. It was a Saturday when I arrived, and it was the last time they allowed weekend trips. And now they'll do it every once in a while if you beg them and you have a really good reason, like a court order or something. But they were ending weekend trips, visits, because it was one of the ways to make it more difficult for attorneys to get there and to make it work with their own lives and practices. So, so I got there on a Saturday. There were no other attorneys. I had made my plans 6 weeks in advance, and although they changed the rules, they allowed me to stay with my plans to go. And As I said, so I was doing this all based on what the instructions others had given me. I got out of the CBQ and took the 7:40 bus, which then takes you to a ferry, and I take a ferry across, and then I was met by an escort, a very nice man who happened to be from Chicago, military escort, who got me my ID pass and took me to see my client. At this point, I had 2 clients because I had agreed in the spring to take on a second client. And the day before I left, I did an emergency motion to the judge of my second client asking for permission to see him because the military said, no, you only put in a request to see your one client, and so we're not going to let you see the other. That's typical military stuff. And so I explained to the judge that I'm a solo practitioner, that this was an expensive trip. I'd like to see my second client. And he agreed and did an order Friday afternoon, ordering the military to allow me to see him. And so I told this to the guard, my escort, on Sunday, and he said, well, tell it to the Monday guy, because everything's closed today. So the next day, I'll tell you about my visit with my client in a minute, but the next day I got in the van with the escort, and it was a different person who I found kind of creepy. For a lot of reasons that I'll explain. He just knew too much about me. But I said to him, I have a court order to see this other client, and I just want to make sure I can arrange it for either Tuesday or Wednesday. And he said, well, court orders don't work here. We consider those only advisory. And I said, oh, okay. And I wrote down my little notes, hoping that they were going to take the judge's advice. And then we just were chit-chatting, and this is the part that got me kind of creeped out, because I said something about my son was going to be starting college in a couple of months. And he said, oh, well, at least you have your daughters. And I was like, what else do you know about me? I mean, it was just like, this is the guard, this is my escort. You know, what do they do, pass around my file? So that was a little disconcerting, and I believe he also read my notes, because as I said, we have to take notes. We're supposed to put them in an envelope at the end of the day. And the notes with Mr. Al-Jazawi, who I met with all day Sunday, I put in an envelope so that I would have them for the next day's meeting, because I was meeting with him over 3 days. And but you're not allowed to seal them until the end. So they were just in an envelope in the van. And the next day, the escort said to me, you know, if your client has any medical issues, you know, you should let us know. And I just smiled, and he said, you know, we want to take care of these issues. And so, you know, if he's got like serious medical issues, and I just, you know, so I knew he read my notes too. So those were kind of the creepy parts. I went into my meeting with Mr. Al-Jazawi in a camp that's called Camp Echo. Camp Echo is made up of little Kwanzaa huts that are divided in 2. And sometimes they're used to keep men there. There's a little cell with a bed, a toilet, and a sink. And then outside that little cell is a meeting room with a table and a couple of chairs. And so each one of these looks like that. They're the mirror of each other. And Mr. Al-Jazawi was sitting at a chair at the table when I walked in. He was shackled to the floor. The hut was pretty cold at that point. They had little air conditioners in there. And when I came in, he asked me if I would turn the temperature down, which up, if I'd make it warmer, whichever way that is. And I said yes, and so I sat down and I introduced myself, and he of course knew me from letters. We had already exchanged a couple letters, but the first thing he said to me is, how do I know you're really an attorney? And it was one of those things that we talked about in that 2-day session, but I had forgotten all about it. But the interrogators were acting as attorneys at one point. After the court had said attorneys could come into the base, they were posing as attorneys and getting the men to think that they were attorneys. So there was a lot of skepticism. And so I took out my business card and I handed it to Mr. Al-Jazawi, who, as I said, fortunately spoke English because I didn't go with a translator. And he just laughed and he said, anybody can print up a business card. and I laughed and I said, you're right, which is why I have this little prop here. This is my wallet that I've had since I became a lawyer. And in Illinois, we get wallet-sized cards every year, a copy of our license. And so I took it out, and if I try to do what I did for him, I'll spend the rest of the day trying to get them back in here, because now I have like 30 of them in here. But I started taking them out, and like one by one, this is my license for this year, this is my license for last year, this is my license for the year before. I did this like 5 or 6 times, and he said, okay, okay. And so I spent 3 days talking with Mr. Al-Jazawi, and the other attorneys arrived on Monday evening and Tuesday, and they're like, 3 days? What do you talk about with this guy for 3 days? And I said, we talked about everything. One of the things that they did tell us at the session, which I think was very good to keep in mind, is that these guys have only known interrogations. And so I didn't want to go in there as an interrogator. So the first day when I went in, I just started talking about myself. I talked about my kids, I talked about my father, who was a retired attorney, who was at that point like 87 years old. He asked a lot of questions about my law practice. I was trying to explain to him that I was a civil rights attorney, but it just didn't ring very true, sitting here with this guy that was being held in indefinite detention. So I explained it to just say I sue the government, and he liked that. So it took a good 5 or 6 hours of me just pretty much rambling on, wondering if this was ever going to end, and he would say something before he started telling me more about himself and how he ended up at Guantanamo. I'm not going to go through all of that with you because we have such a short amount of time, but I do want to tell you that he was released in 2010. He was released to the country of Georgia, who agreed to take on 3 men from Guantanamo as part of, I think we built them a runway. I don't know. That's what I heard, that we built them a runway in return for taking 3 guys. Mr. Al-Jazawi is still in Georgia. He's been there 3 years now. It was a 3-year deal, and I never knew what that meant, and I was afraid to ask. What are you going to do with him at the end of 3 years? He still does not have a passport in Georgia. He's not considered a citizen. The 3 years has passed, but he still has an apartment. They're paying for him, and they're giving him education and medical care. My other client is indefinitely held, and we can talk about that more in the question and answer session, but I'll just tell you that if he's the kind of person that we have to hold indefinitely because we have no evidence to pursue them in a court of law, and there's not enough evidence to pursue them in a military court, if he's an example of that, this is all bullshit for the indefinite ones too. Because the reason he's being held is because he was arrested at a guest house in Pakistan where another person was staying that the government thought was a bad guy. And they don't even have the evidence that that person was the bad guy they thought he was. So my guy's there, guilt by association, even though he didn't even know the person. It was a pretty big guest house. It's kind of like, do you have to go and get the guest list at every bed and breakfast you stay at now to make sure there's no one there that the government might think is bad, and therefore you're bad too? There's a million stories about how the government has conducted itself, both in the Bush administration and I think worse under the Obama administration. And maybe I can share some of that in the question and answer.
Worse.
Worse.